The Cleveland Guardians got the number 1 overall pick in this year's draft lottery. Let's talk about it.
You are Locked On MLB Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on in to Locked On MLB Prospects, your home for all things minor league baseball. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby, award-winning baseball writer and podcaster. Thank you for making this your first listen every single day. We're probably part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. And I want this to be your show. If you have show ideas, questions for Monday's mailbag, segment ideas, tons of ways to get them to us. I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball, shows on Twitter at Locked On Farm. Everything else, subtext, Discord, email, all of that stuff in the episode description, in the show notes. We have a link tree down there. While you're in there, do us a favor, throw us a like on your favorite podcast platform. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to the show, all that good stuff. And I do want to say, been at the winter meetings all week. It has been a ton of fun. Thank you to everybody who listens, who watches, who shares the pod, who interacts with us. I was able to do this because of y'all, so thank you. I was in the room for the MLB Draft Lottery as they made the announcement, and the Cleveland Guardians get the number 1 overall pick in the 2023 MLB Draft. It was absolutely wild. A little bit later, I'm going to be talking to Jeff Carr of Locked On Reds about what they do with number 2, because that's the first real question in the draft. Number 1, I feel like as of now, is pretty understood what the pick's going to be. So stay tuned for that. And we also talk about what it was like in the room. But in the draft, the Cleveland Guardians go from a 2% chance. They had the 9th best odds of getting the number 1 overall pick. They get the number 1 overall pick. And so they are by far the winners of this lottery. The second team, the Cincinnati Reds, they are the other big winner of the draft lottery. They had the 14th best odds out of only technically 18 teams, but really 17 because Washington wasn't eligible. They had 0.90% odds, and they rose all the way to number 2. Now, the big deal here is obviously you get a pick of better players, right? And it's the question about what is the tier 1 of the draft? Is it a top 3, a top 5, whatever it might be? And in this one, right now, we're looking at the big 3. First baseman Nick Kurtz of Wake Forest, second baseman Travis Bizzara of Oregon State, and second baseman J.J. Weatherholt of West Virginia. Again, we'll talk about those 3 guys in the third segment. But the other big aspect of this, it's not just they get to move up and they get better selections, but it's also the money that is involved with those better picks. So I went and used last year, so 2023 MLB draft slot values, and I looked at where the odds said they should have been. In this case, Cleveland at 9, Cincinnati at 14. And instead of that slot value, what is the slot value of the pick that they got in the draft? Now, these are going to change slightly because the draft values, the slot values change every single year. But the Cleveland Guardians going from number 9 to number 1, their draft pool going off of last year's values would be $4,004,100 larger than it would have been had they stayed at number 9. So they get an additional $4 million to play with that they wouldn't have had. And then obviously they're into that tier 1 of the best options in this draft. And the thing about Cleveland is they are very, very good. As much as their fans like to think that they are cheap, they are very, very good at using every single dollar of that draft pool. The reminder here is you can go 5% over the total amount of your pool without penalties. So to make it simple, if it's a $10 million pool, you can go $10,500,000 in total signings and not have any sort of penalty for going over that 10 million, as long as you keep it at 5%. Cleveland is very, very good at using that 5% and not exceeding it. I want to say it was maybe last year, the year before, they literally hit it right on by like $1. Like they're very, very good at maximizing their money. And so for Cleveland now, you have your choice of just about any prospect. You obviously have a lot more money to play with, but the Reds have even more money because Cleveland went up 8 spots from number 9 to number 1, but Cincinnati was going to be at 14. And so they went from 14 to 2. They went up 12 spots. So going up 12 spots, they unlocked an additional, using last year's numbers, $4,335,400. Again, the difference in the slot value between the number 14 pick and the number 2 pick last year. So they unlocked more money, even more than the Guardians did, because they made a bigger jump. And so when you look at this draft order, it's really interesting because most teams moved down. Only a couple teams actually went up. Like I said, the Guardians and Reds obviously went up. But when you go down towards the bottom of this, the Cubs and Mariners, they had the 17th and 18th best odds to pick number 1 overall. They end up 14th and 15th. So they moved up a little bit. And some of that is because the Mets got moved back 10 spots. They would have been 9th. They ended up being, or they would have been odds-wise, they're at 7th best odds. They ended up being 19th because they got the 9th overall pick and moved back 10 spots. And a reminder on that, the Mets, the Padres, and the Yankees, because of how much money they spent relative to the competitive balance tax, they were in a situation where their picks were going to get moved back 10 spots if they were not in the top 6 for the lottery. We have them in the losers section because I have the money that they lost by getting moved. So we'll get to those in the next segment. But because you saw the Mets get kicked back from 9 to 19, it gave and then a little bit better picks. You saw the Cubs, the Mariners be able to move up. Again, Cubs from 17 to 14, Mariners from 18 to 15, and that exactly correlates with the Mets, the Padres, and the Yankees all getting moved down. So we have this order set. As a quick reminder before we get to the next segment, the order itself, Guardians and Reds are 1 and 2. The Rockies had the third best, or tied for the best odds at 18.3% of getting the number 1 overall pick. They were tied with the A's and the Royals. They are picking at 3. So they, in essence, did not move. They just ended up being the 3rd out of 3 teams with the best odds. Looking at this, the White Sox at 5, the A's at 4, Royals at 6, Cardinals at 7, Nationals picked at 10. This was a really interesting one, and I'm going to go ahead and tell the story now before getting to it in the losers section. The way that the actual lottery works, the logistics of this is it's a series of ping pong balls. There's a machine, and it's 4 ping pong balls, and each ping pong ball has a number, and together it creates a code that corresponds to a specific team. And they realize, okay, the Nationals could not pick in the top 10 because they're a market that pays into revenue sharing, and they were in the lottery last year. And MLB realized if we just take their ping pong balls out, that messes up the odds for everybody else. So what we'll do instead is we will leave their ping pong balls in the draft. And if we end up drawing their ping pong balls, the combination of numbers that gives them the pick, we'll just dump it all back in and redo it. We'll just throw it out. It doesn't count if the Nationals are the team that we draw. So the first time they did the drawing, the Nationals would have won the number 1 overall pick. They were the ones that were selected. And so MLB had to throw them back in and redo it. And when they redid it, the Guardians were the ones that won. Each drawing of ping pong balls, it's 4 balls, and the numbers together equal a code that corresponds to the team. Each drawing of the 4 ping pong balls was for 1 spot, and then they had to do a whole nother drawing to figure out the next spot. So they threw the first one out because that was the Nationals. They drew the Guardians. They did a drawing now, the 3rd drawing of the night, to pick the number 2 overall spot, and they drew the Nationals again and had to throw that one out because the Nationals can't pick inside the top 10. And so the Nationals technically could have had the number 1 and or number 2 overall picks, but because they're a revenue sharing payor, they pay into the revenue sharing program, and they had a lottery pick last year, number 2 overall. They signed Dylan Cruz out of LSU. Because they had that, they could not be any higher than number 10 this year. So every time they got chosen, which again would have been number 1 and number 2 overall, their ping pong balls got thrown back in and the drawing was done again. In just a minute, speaking of teams that got kind of messed up by the drawing, I want to talk about the losers of this because there's a surprisingly high number of losers of this. We'll talk about that next right here on Locked on MLB Prospects. But first, today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Jace Medical. I know we come to sports to kind of escape from some of the crazy realities of life, but I want to talk about preparing for tough situations. Like if you're on extended travel, maybe you're at the winter meetings, bracing for a major weather event, you're limited by like a supply shortage. You can be covered because of our partners at Jace Medical. They have life-saving antibiotics and a long list of daily medications that can be ordered on a 1-year supply. They even have ED generics for Cialis and Viagra. So this is both the Jace Case and Jace Daily. Jace Case is the pack of 5 different antibiotics that treats a long list of bacterial infections. It could be UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, skin infections, things like that. Could happen to any of us. The Jace Daily, that is the emergency supply of your medication. Some medications can be up to a 1-year supply that you can keep in reserve for if you need it. So visit jacemedical.com, complete your what they call their physician encounter. It'll get reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications, if approved, will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jacemedical.com, use offer code Locked On to get $20 off your order. Okay, so the losers of the MLB Draft Lottery, there are a bunch. Okay, so I mentioned earlier in the first segment, I mentioned the 3 teams, the Mets, the Padres, the Yankees, that were going to get their picks moved back at least 10 spots, depending on where it came out, right? So the Mets had the 7th best odds. They would have picked at number 9. That got kicked 10 spots back to 19. So that means their draft pool, again, using last year's slot values, is $2,395,100 less than it would have been had they picked at number 7. The Padres would have picked at 15. They got kicked back to 25. That ended up being $1,323,200 less than they would have gotten last year. And the Yankees going from 16 to 26, right behind the Padres, means $1.261 million, just behind the Padres, a pick ahead of them. Now, because of that, that meant some playoff teams ended up picking in the top 18. It's supposed to be playoff teams outside that top 18. The Marlins were at 16, the Brewers at 17, and the Rays at 18. Those 3 teams moved up because 3 teams got kicked back out of the draft. So they all got some extra money. But the losers of this, the real losers, 3 teams, right? Team number 1, and no team has probably lost in the draft lottery in its 2 years of existence more than the Oakland A's. Worst record in baseball last year. They were tied with the Rockies and the Royals for the best odds of the number 1 overall pick at 18.3%. And the A's ended up getting the number 4 overall pick. The other reason this is tough, and again, we're going to dive into this more in the third segment, is as of now, early December, this is considered to be a 3-player draft at the top of the draft. 3 guys, you're picking 4th, unless somebody goes outside of the box, you're not going to get one of those guys. Sucks, right? So obviously that's an issue. What also makes this worse, and the reason the A's are the biggest loser of this, is the fact they picked in the lottery last year too. And a team that receives revenue sharing money, like the A's, cannot pick in the lottery more than 2 consecutive years. They had it last year. They had it this year. So next year, they can't pick any earlier than number 10 overall. And the issue here is the 2024 Oakland A's don't project to be any better than the 2023 Oakland A's were. So this year's draft is considered to be not as good, obviously, as last year's. Last year was a generational draft. No draft is going to compare to that in the next couple of years. But this draft is considered to be not as good as the 2025 draft. So they fell backwards in this draft just far enough to stay in the lottery, but not get one of the big three. And they can't pick higher than 10th next year. The Oakland A's really got hosed by this. The Kansas City Royals fell back, again, tied for the best odds, fell back to number 6. So similar situation. They're still in the lottery, which means that affects the ability to be in lotteries in the future, next year, going forward, things like that. But again, it's a big 3 draft, and it's potential this expands to 4 or maybe 5, depending on what some of the prepsters do. You typically don't see that tier 1 be more than about 5 players. And so they're picking at number 6 after being tied for the best odds of the number 1 overall pick. So I think they'd have had the number 2 overall pick if it just went off of the old format of the draft, right? And then another team that really kind of got hosed on this, still picking in the top 10, still picking in the top 5, but the Chicago White Sox. They had the 5th best odds of getting a number 1 overall pick, and they're picking 5th. So they didn't really move. But the issue with this is they are in the lottery, but again, outside of that top group, they project to be one of the worst teams in baseball in 2024. They may legitimately have the worst record in baseball in 2024. And if they do, they can't pick inside the top 10. So you could have both the A's and the White Sox would have the best odds of the number 1 and number 2 overall pick, and both pick outside the top 10. So the draft lottery, and for the White Sox, they're a team. They do not receive revenue sharing based on market size. They cannot be in their back-to-back years. I don't believe they don't receive revenue sharing, but it's a large market. It's a revenue paying market. And so they pay into the revenue sharing, or they're supposed to. And so they can't be in the top 10 in back-to-back years. So the big losers here, the A's, the Royals, the White Sox. A lot of people are saying the Rockies are a loser in this top 3 pick. They were tied with 2 other teams for the best odds. No, they didn't get 1 or 2, but they didn't fall out of the top 3. And again, going off of the big 3 in this class, they should get a quality player there. The Mets, again, dropped to 19. The Padres, the Yankees both dropped. For the most part, that's really it as far as significant drops. You see teams like the Angels, they had the 6th best odds. They're picking 8th. A lot of teams got bumped back 2 spots by the Guardians and Reds jumping up to skip them. The Cardinals had the 5th best odds. They're picking 7th. The Pirates had the 8th best odds. They're picking 9th because the Guardians, one team, the different teams that jumped them and things like that. So really, again, your losers here, the A's, the White Sox, the Royals. Your winners, definitely the Guardians and the Reds, and then to a lesser extent, because of little tiny bits of movement, Cubs, Mariners, Marlins, Brewers, Rays, things like that. In just a minute, we're going to talk to Jeff Carr, host of Locked On Reds. I hopped on with him after the draft lottery was over to talk about their options at number 2 overall, because again, we are pretty confident who at 1-1 would go to the Cleveland Guardians as of now. So we talked about options at number 2, if they stick in that big 3, or guys who might break into it. Stay tuned for that. We'll be back in just a minute.
All right, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes here with our prospects expert, Lindsay Crosby, Locked On MLB Prospects, as a extremely just out of the blue. I was not expecting. In fact, I made the pick, and it was more colloquial than anything, that the Reds would get the number 12 pick in the draft. And it'd be like, all right, we're picking 12th. That's fun. We'll see what we get. They're picking 2nd. After a 0.9% chance of being the number 1 overall pick, they were 1 pick away. And firstly, before we jump into the oh my gosh, who can they get? Because they have so many options now at the number 2 pick. I wanted to start with that first. Like, what was the reaction in the room when everybody's just like, Kansas City 6, Oakland 2 or 4? Who was getting the number 1 pick?
So what they don't tell you is a lot of team personnel are in the rows. So the actual drawing is done a couple hours before the broadcast. but the team officials who are on the stage are sequestered. They don't have their phones. They can't tell anybody. So nobody in the room but the hosts and the people on stage actually know. And so I'm sitting there in the crowd, and I'm sitting next to a guy from the Mets, and I'm sitting next to on the side a guy from the Cubs, and behind me is a lady with, like Arizona. And it's really interesting to kind of see the murmurs and people looking around as they start going through teams and they start eliminating folks. The Oakland folks were not happy. The White Sox guys were actually not happy because they didn't want to be a top 6 team. And for those of you who are listening to Locked on MLB Prospects for this, we talked about that earlier in the show. And so it was, a lot of people were surprised and shocked. And when it got down to, when they announced the Rockies at 3, it was just a lot of like murmuring, like, whoa, this is, what were the odds of these two teams being up at 1 and at 2? So really exciting, fun to be in the room. And what they didn't tell you is every time the camera cut away to the crew, Brad Paisley's chucking those cards at full speed into the crowd. It was hilarious.
and I mean, honestly, Devin Mesoraco, as far as his career, was a very up and down career as a Cincinnati Red, but he's kind of going to go down as like a folk hero almost now, because he actually tweeted hours before the lottery that he was going to go up and appeal to the draft gods for all of his surgeries and his time that he spent on the IL to give the Reds a top 3 pick. It worked.
They listened.
The draft gods listened, and now the Reds have an opportunity. There's a lot of interesting guys here. I've seen some names. I haven't really started to dive in on this. You and both our friend Jeff Ellis over at Locked On Guardians are draft experts for Locked On MLB. So with the number 2 pick, I mean, obviously the Guardians are going to get top pick, but we get like second top pick. I'm looking at this from the most optimistic point of view ever, but I know that there's options for the Reds, right?
Yeah, and the big thing you always want to know about the very top of the draft, I know you guys aren't used to being here, it's kind of cool, is every draft is defined by the size of that top tier. And in this case, as of now, early December, it's a top 3. So you guys are at 2, you're going to get one of those guys. And looking at the 3, your options are Nick Kurtz, the first baseman for Wake Forest, and then 2 second basemen, Travis Pizarro from Oregon State and JJ Weatherholt from West Virginia. Travis Pizarro is going to be playing some shortstop this year. And as we stand right now, if this board does not change, he is a 99.9% lock to go to Cleveland. They are a very heavy model team. They have computer models for making these picks, and he hits every single box that they love in their models. I've already talked to Jeff Ellis about it. We both agree that would be the pick as of now. So your choice comes down to first baseman Nick Kurtz of West Virginia or JJ Weatherholt, the second baseman out of West Virginia. So Kurtz from Wake Forest, Weatherholt from West Virginia, they're both offensive first players. The question is more of, what skill do you value more? Kurtz has some of the best raw power in this entire class, just massive offense. That is his thing. JJ Weatherholt is very, very good power, not as good as Kurtz, but he also has very good contact ability. He can use the whole field. He's not one of those guys that pulls all of his home runs. And so position doesn't matter this high in the draft. The question is, do you want the purest of pure power hitters, or do you want a more well-rounded offensive option at the second overall pick?
I know that position doesn't quite matter, but find yourself a middle infielder that Nick Krall doesn't want to select. And I don't know who that person is. So it might end up being Weatherholt. And I know that we kind of talked about this off air. I mean, you got the big 3, you got the Bulbasaur, the Charmander, and the Squirtle of it all. But there's a couple of dark horses that could sneak up in there. There's a pitcher, there's a couple of outfielders, and like we always talk about this with the MLB draft. You really don't pick based on your current positional need. Like most Reds fans would say they need an outfielder, they need pitching, like things like that. But you're drafting for 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. So that's not necessarily going to be the case here. But could there be somebody that sneaks in there and at least puts some doubt as to whether it would be Kurtz or Weatherholt?
Yeah. So, and you're right on on the money with you're not drafting for what you need now. You're drafting for a couple years from now. A college guy, which I'm going to tell you, take a college guy because this is the draft to get a college bat versus going and getting a preps or something like that. But it's 2 seasons at best, usually 3. The 2 outfielders that have a chance to rise into that top 3 and make that a big 5 or something like that. Vance Honeycutt from North Carolina and Charlie Condon from Georgia. And both of them, little bit of the reason they're not already in that top 3 is there's some lingering questions about these guys. I like Condon more than Honeycutt because of the types of questions. So Charlie Condon, the reason he's not necessarily there yet is weirdly, he redshirted his freshman year. And that's typically not something that you see from a guy that's being considered for a first-round pick, never mind top 5 overall. And so he had a phenomenal 2023, obviously won a bunch of awards, but it was something where we have a limited track record on Charlie Condon versus somebody else. And that's kind of why he's not necessarily there in that top 3 yet. He's also a left fielder. So from a defensive perspective, there's a little bit of less value than a guy who can play center or even right field. So depending on what happens this year, he looks like he could be a power hitting outfielder. He also has some experience playing first base. So there's a versatile profile there. But Charlie Condon's one option. And then the other guy, Vance Honeycutt, he's the biggest potential, question, because he gorgeous swing. He's done a really, really good job of showing speed, of showing power, of showing all 5 tools. But in 2 years in college baseball, he's also not batted 300 yet. And typically in college, when we're looking at offensive performers, we're looking for, are you hitting 20 home runs? Are you stealing 20 bases? And then your slash line is usually a 3.45 or a 3.46 or a 3.47. And he hasn't yet batted 300. He got pitched around a lot in 2023 in his second year. And so his batting average was closer to 250. And and then his strikeout rate got better, but still not great. I want to say it was somewhere in the 20%. And so the question now is, what does he do in that draft year to show that he deserves to be a top 3, top 5 pick? All of the tools are there. We've seen the contact ability. We've seen the power. We've seen the speed, the defense, the arm is good. All of that stuff could play center field, but offensively, we have some questions about the overall package. And then because everybody wants to know about the arms, Chase Burns of Wake Forest is the top pitcher, transferred from Tennessee to Wake Forest. You guys just took a Wake Forest pitcher in Rhett Lauder, so you're familiar with the school and what they do. Obviously, the pitching lab is a big part of why he transferred. So kind of streamlining his mechanics, hoping to get the changeup looking a little bit better. Wake Forest guys have great changeups. Again, Rhett Lauder. So he's an option that would give you an upper 90s fastball, a really good slider that's kind of 2-plane breakdown and away, and then a changeup should get better. He's your option there. And then the wild card, Jack Caglione of Florida, because he's a 2-way player. First baseman and a left-handed pitcher, can hit 100. Exit velos, if you trust Florida's numbers, there's questions about that, but exit velos of 115 in college, massive power, has a little more raw than everybody else, but if he puts it together, which he might, he just looks like a phenomenal talent. So a couple different options. You're going to be watching a lot of college baseball, I think, in the spring to see who Cincinnati should take. And then obviously, any of your listeners can check out Locked MLB Prospects. We're talking about these guys just about every single week between now and the draft in July.
It'll be interesting to see. I know the last time that the Reds had a number 2 overall pick, they picked a 2-way guy, although they turned him into a pitcher rather quickly thereafter. But Hunter Green, last number 2 overall pick,
worked out for you.
This Cincinnati, it worked out pretty well, and we'll definitely be talking a lot more about this as we get closer and closer to the draft. It's like 6-7 months away. Sorry, can't add 7 months away. But really excited to see the number 2 overall pick. And Lindsay does have a lot more analysis of the draft lottery over on Locked On MLB Prospects. Make sure you jump over there right now.